Hi everyone, welcome to FX PhD. This is the After Effects for Broadcast Design course. My name's Tim Clapham from Hyper TV. I'll be taking this course for the term. In this first lesson, what we'll be doing is we'll be creating a short title sequence based on a client storyboard. We're going to kind of treat this as if it was a real job and a bit of a rush job at that. We're going to take the storyboard that we've been supplied from our client and see if we can take it from beginning to end to a deliverable product. So let's get started. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but we normally start a job with a storyboard from a client. They normally look something like this. Pretty rough, as you can see, but it gives us a rough idea of what we want to do. So what I've done first of all is taken this storyboard and worked it up in Illustrator into some artwork to present to the client. If we get approval on that, then what we do is we just jump in and start building the project. Let's have a look at the Illustrator file. So we'll just quit out of Photoshop and jump into Illustrator. Here we go. You can see I've worked that up quite a bit. As you can see, the storyboard consists of some geometric shapes and some kind of large typographical elements. The graphic text flows down, we zoom into this, there's some more text, finally we resolve on the title of the program. As you can see, we've got a palette defined already. I've set up some swatches, so the first thing we're going to do is work out how we can get these swatches into After Effects. So the first thing I'm going to do is just click on this little pop-out menu, save swatch library as ASE. Navigate to the class and we'll call it Graphic Review Swatches. Okay, let's jump back to After Effects. Now the thing is with After Effects, natively there's no way of actually importing a swatch. But thankfully we've got the internet. In Adobe's website there's a part called Adobe Exchange, which is a great resource. I totally recommend going there. But one of the things they have there is a swatch import script. I'll give the URL in the forums, but let me just show you the page. Here we go. There's quite a few scripts in here. The one we're really interested in is called Swatch You Want. They've been written by Jeff Almasol. Thanks very much, Jeff, very useful. So when you've downloaded these scripts, you basically put them in the scripts folder in your After Effects folder, restart After Effects, and then they're available to be used. I've already installed that, so if I go to the window menu, I can come down to Swatch You Want, and up pops a little palette. This little button here will allow us to choose a swatch, so we choose our graphic swatches, click open, and there we go. We can then dock this into our layout for use later. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to set up the project window with some folders so that it's nicely organised. I like to try and keep the project window as organised as possible, so if I have to come back to the project in 6 months I can still understand what's going on, and even more importantly, if I have to send it to a colleague or someone at another company, they can easily decipher what I've done. For now I've just created two folders, one called Comps and one AI for Adobe Illustrator. The Comps folder, prefix it with an asterisk, that leaves it at the top of the project window at all time. For this lesson we're going to work in Power Widescreen. First thing I'm going to do is just create a new comp. If I select the comp folder first, it will be in there, so it's Command or Control N, Comp Settings, we call this Graphic Review Main. We go for widescreen square pixel, duration of 10 seconds. The next thing I'm going to do is create the square graphics and the lines from the storyboard. I'm just going to use solids for those. I won't make you sit there watch me create loads of solids, so I'll just do that and then we'll come back. One thing I do just want to quickly show you is, I mean it's pretty obvious but I'll show you anyway, it's just how you use the swatch palette. I'm just going to go Command Y to create a new solid, 200 by 200, and then simply just use the pipette to pick the colour that you want. So I'm going to pick the red and then click OK. I've created 4 solids, 200 by 200, 100 by 100, 50 by 50 and 25 by 25. You'll notice that what I've also done is adjusted the anchor point. That's placed it in the bottom left corner of each solid. The reason for that is because we're going to want them to scale up from that point. I'm just going to create some more of the elements for the layout. Here's the 2 green bars. They're quite long, they're 1500 wide by 10 high. The reason I've made them that wide is because they're going to be on a diagonal, and I really don't want to have to come back and make them bigger later. For now I'm just going to create one more solid and make it comp size, pick this very light colour, and that's going to be the background, so I'll just drag that to the bottom and I'm actually going to lock that layer. Now would probably be a good time to save the project, so I'm just going to save that and then we'll carry on. Let's call it graphic review. Makes sense. We'll just 01. Save. If we just jump back to Illustrator and look at the storyboard, you can see that the squares and the lines are used a few times, so it's probably a good idea to pre-compose the animation in After Effects so we don't have to animate them several times. We can just reuse the pre-comp. So what I'm going to do, just select these layers, Shift Command C, pre-comp, and I'm just going to call this graphic elements. Move all attributes into the new comp. You can see we've now got the pre-comp here. If we alt double click that, that will open that composition for us to work on. So now I'm just going to resize the comp and kind of adjust the layout of all the squares, etc., so it matches the storyboard. So I've arranged all the elements in the comp where we want them. The next thing I'm going to do is just animate them. It's a 4-second comp. I think for the main comp, each kind of shot, as it were, will be up for just over 3 seconds. So 4 seconds for the pre-comp should be fine. Rather than animate each solid individually, I'm just going to parent these 3 to the red solid. So now if I open up my scale and position, I can kind of scrub these values and they all move with it, or they all scale up and down with it. So first of all I'm just going to set the scale of this to 25 and I'm just going to scrub this back until it's hidden off the side. Set a key for each of those, go to the end, set this to 225 and then just scrub this so that it's just on the edge again. Okay. That looks like that. The next thing I'm going to do is animate the 2 green bars, just the position to be honest. So I've jumped to the beginning of the comp. I'm just going to literally drag them off the side, set a keyframe for each, and then I'm going to go to 3 seconds and drag them so they are back in the middle. Rather than both green lines appear simultaneously, I'm just going to offset the keys so that they're slightly staggered. So just deselect, then click on the word position to select both keyframes. I'm just going to drag this up, say 10 frames. Let's have a quick look. That looks okay. Okay, so that's the pre-comp setup. We can use that several times, so now we should go about setting up the main comp. Before we do that, there's a couple of things that I just need to set. I'm just going to select all of these layers, press F4, and I'm going to switch on continuous rasterization, and I'm going to switch on motion blur. Now's a good time to save it again. You could always have the auto save on in preferences, or what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the increment and save. Great. So let's carry on. So let's switch back to the main comp and carry on laying it out. As you can see, the pre-comp's in there, it's now animated. First thing I'm going to do is just switch on collapse transformations, and the reason I'm doing that is because this is actually going to scale up more, so we need to do that so the continuous rasterization kind of is pulled through from the pre-comp. If we just go back to Illustrator and have a quick look at the storyboard. Okay, so you can see that we have this large dark browny red with the word graphic kind of running through it. So let's build that part. Just going to move this all up and over. See, I've made a slight mistake. The green bar there has actually gone a little bit too far. I'm just going to go back to the pre-comp and fix that. It's actually not a mistake, it's me just being a bit silly there. It's because the red square hasn't reached its destination, as it were, and that's why. So it doesn't really matter. It's all going to be at an angle, and these bits are going to be off the sides anyway, so let's just carry on. So I'm going to add a new solid. It's going to be quite big, and then I'm going to import the graphic text and drag that into the comp too. That's the solid made. Just import the artwork. I've actually set the logo up so that it's an Illustrator file with each word on a separate layer, so we can import that as a comp with crop layers. We don't actually need the comp that's created, we just want the Illustrator layers. So let's drag the word graphic into our comp as well. I'm just going to hide the graphic elements for a moment, pull this down, select the other layer and just pull it up so we can see what we're doing, zoom in slightly. Y for the pan behind tool, which allows you to move the anchor point. If you've got two layers selected, it doesn't work. There we go. Okay, and you can see that we've also got some artifacting where we've zoomed in. Just reminds me I need to switch on continuous rasterization for those layers. I'm also going to enable motion blur. Zoom out a little, press S. I'm just going to scale this up, say 300, 250. Okay, that looks about right. Great thing is we can actually add effects to continually rasterizing elements. Never used to be able to do that, but it's quite a cool feature. I'm just going to add the fill effect. Okay, and use the pick whip to pick the same background color. Let's just switch on the graphic elements and line these up. Like so. Now we can position it so it looks like the storyboard. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to add a null and parent everything to it. It just makes it a little bit easier. Let's just drag these items up so we can see what we're doing. I know from the storyboard that we need to zoom in to the edge of this piece, so probably that's the most obvious place to attach the null. So I'm just going to go layer, new, null object, and zoom in and just position that on that edge. Now if we select our three layers and parent them to the null, which I'm going to rename and call it main controller 01, we can now use this for our positioning. R for rotation, -45. Let's just quickly have a look at the storyboard to see where it's got to be. Okay, it kind of starts there and ends here. So I'm just going to drag that into place. Okay, so the green line showing there. Now the great thing about parenting is that all these other elements now have a new coordinate system. Rather than being based on the comp, they're based on the position of this null. What that means is that I can open up the graphic elements layer, press P, and I can now scrub that value and it will work. It will stay on the right angle. This makes it much easier. I know we're working on 45 degrees, so you could probably snap to it, but when you're working with an arbitrary angle, parenting makes things a lot easier like that. So let's just scrub through it and see what the square animation looks like. Okay, that seems to work fine. So the next thing we're going to do is do the first transition. Again, I'm just going to incrementally save. Okay, we don't need the swatch palette for now, so let's just hide that. Main controller, I'm just going to open up anchor point and scale. I'm going to set a key for these as well. I'm not actually sure if I need to animate the anchor point yet, but we can always get rid of the keyframe later. Jump forward 10 frames and set the rotation and scale. Jump back to Illustrator again just to have a quick look at what position it needs to be in. This is the point at the beginning of the next kind of shot, so we're going to aim for that. Okay, so I'm going to set the scale to 600 and the rotation about 130, I reckon. Okay, it's not too bad, it's slightly over to the right, so we will need to adjust the anchor point. If we hold down the command key and scrub these values, everything will move a little bit slower and we can be more precise. I'd say that looks about right. I want it to snap out of these keys and kind of ease into these, so just select these keys, press F9 for an easy ease. Let's just scrub that and check that everything's working as it should. Okay. Now before I go any further, what I want to do is switch on motion blur and do a little preview and make sure there isn't any problems. So I'm just going to press N to set my out point there, and then I'm going to do a round preview. Be back in a sec. So there we go, it's now previewing. It may look okay, but I think I've spotted a few major problems in there, so let's just scrub through and have a look. Okay, if you look up here, the motion blur has gone a bit funky for some reason. It's not too bad on the graphic, although we have got a bit of a problem at the top of the A as well, where you can see the brown coming through. Now the issue with the motion blur on the pre-comp is kind of new to me. I'm not sure whether it's a bug or not, but it seems to have been introduced with CS3 with the new motion blur. I've tried many different things to get rid of this, and when it occurs, it's if you've got continuously rasterized elements in a pre-comp and then you collapse transformations, and this is what happens. You may think that you could kind of go into the comp settings, into advanced, and mess around with these parameters and that will fix it, but it doesn't. Now the only way I've worked out to resolve this is to switch them to 3D layers. So that's what I'm going to do. If we just go back to our graphic elements and just make all of those 3D and come back, you can now see that the motion blur is much better. Zoom in a bit closer and you can still see it's a little bit funky. We can see the stepping of the motion blur. So now we can actually go into our comp settings, advanced. This is the number of samples a frame. We can set that to say 32. And there you go. I mean, you can still see some stair steps there, so we could increase it to 64 if we want, but I'm just going to go with that for now. The other issue is this kind of area here. I mean, we could almost get away with it, but if it was slightly slower, the motion blur, then you definitely see a kind of dark line where the A's blurring and the background's blurring, and you get the two blurs sort of muddying together. The only way to really resolve that is to actually cut the letters out of that solid. We could try doing it with a track matte, so rather than having the graphic as the same colour of the background, we could just set this solid to a inverse track matte. But again, you're going to get the same problem because the matte will be blurring and the solid will be blurring, so where one cuts out the other, you're going to get this kind of dirtiness. So what I'm going to do to resolve that is I'm actually going to create a mask and actually cut it out. As this solid's so huge, rather than work in here, I'm going to create a temporary comp and work in there. So I'm going to come back here, open up the solids, just drag this on to create a new comp, and then I'm going to go into Illustrator, select the path and copy and paste it. So I select the graphic, Command E, we're into Illustrator, wake up, there we go, click here to select the graphic path, copy, back to After Effects, select that layer, paste it in. We're going to need it the other way around, so if we just press M to see all our masks, select them all and set that to subtract. If we deselect, you notice we've got a few problems with the holes. All I need to do is just set those masks to add. So I've set those to add. Now I'm just going to select all the masks and scale them up. If you just press the tilde, it will show us the whole timeline, makes it a bit easier to work with. Select the masks, tilde to go back, tilde to just show the comp window, zoom out slightly, Command T, and then we can scale it up. So I've scaled it up and positioned it. May need to be a bit bigger, but we can sort that out later. Tilde to come back to our normal layout. Now I'm just going to select this, copy and paste it into the main comp. We don't need this comp anymore. I was just using it for ease for setting up. So I'll delete that. Now it's just a matter of resizing and positioning that solid. If we parent it to the main controller, first of all, I'm just going to switch off motion blur. Now if we look at the rotation for this, we can set that to 0 and it immediately takes on the correct rotation. That's, as I was saying before, because it's taken on the coordinate system of the null. Zoom out a little bit, and now we're just going to reposition this. We may need to scale the mask up a little bit more. Wait and see. So if we just set the opacity of this layer to 50%, we can see what we're doing slightly more. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and now I'm just going to reposition this. The mask is, there's no doubt about it, it definitely needs scaling up. Look how small it is. First of all, let's just check the scale of this, because we parented it to the null. It's got on the null's coordinate system, so the scale's probably changed. Yeah, it has, you see. So let's just set that to 100 and see where we stand. Okay, it's not too bad at all. I'm just going to scale up the mask so it fits. Okay, that looks about right. We can now set our opacity back to 100 and delete the other layers underneath that we don't need anymore. Just to make sure that's okay, let's just scrub through. Yeah, that looks cool. We should check that it works with motion blur, because that was the whole point of doing this. So you can see I haven't switched on continuous rasterization as well, so I'm just going to switch that on motion blur for that layer. So if we enable motion blur for the comp temporarily, and there we go, we can see that now we've got a kind of clean, sweet motion blur going through there, none of that muddiness that we had before. Great stuff. So now we can carry on blocking out the animation. Switch motion blur off. So the next thing to do, if we just move to the next keyframe, we just need to position the kind of squares and the green lines and add in the review text. Just going to drag this layer down so my main controller stays at the top, and then I'm just going to drag the review text in. There it is. If we just parent that to the null, press R, zero it out so we see where we stand. Okay, so that needs to be set to -90, and then we can just adjust the anchor point. And the scale. Switch on continuous rasterization, motion blur. That looks about right. The next thing to do is just to set the colour for that, so I'll open up my swatches, add the fill effect, and pick the dark red. Now with review, we can adjust the position. Sorry, wrong parameter. Like so. Go back to Illustrator, let's have a quick look. Okay, so we can see that it's going to zoom into the eye of review, and we need to get that eye so that the diagonal is the same as this. Before we do that, I'm just going to drag in the graphic elements pre-comp so that we've got the squares and the green lines all animating across. Once that's in there, we can set up the next transition. So I'm going to drag the graphic elements pre-comp in, parent it to this controller, hit R, -90, the same as the review text. Okay, P for position. Let's bring it down, and then let's just bring it up so it's in the right sort of place. We need to trim this layer so that it starts there. So if we just scrub now, there we go. Notice here as well that review is visible there, so I'm just going to jump to these keyframes and trim that layer to there too. That was wrong. Undo. Right, the mistake I made there was because it's still parented. We just need to set that to none. Now we can drag it to there and then reparent it. We can also trim this layer because we don't need that anymore. There's no point in After Effects calculating a layer that's not needed. I'm also just going to reposition this graphic elements layer slightly, just so that corner is there. Otherwise the graphics don't really come on soon enough, so now they appear straight away. As soon as we hit that frame, they're already animating. So the next thing is to create the next transition. What I'm going to do is just going to save it again, increment and save, and we're off. So to animate the next transition, we could carry on animating the main controller. The problem with that is it's going to be there's a bit of a gotcha when you do that. You can't go on keep scaling that up forever. I'll just show you why. So I've set a few keys for the main controller. Basically I've scaled it up to 3300 and animated the anchor point and rotation so it's in the right place. So you can see now it zooms in on the side of the eye and we end up with it in the right place. That all seems great. The main issue with this is because the scale is so big, it becomes very difficult to control elements accurately. Let me show you what I mean. If I drag in part of the logo type, graphic for instance, open up scale. Now that scale is set to 100%. Watch what happens when we parent it to the main controller now. The scale jumps to 3%. Makes it very difficult to fine tune that. The reason for that is because it's on the main control coordinate system. So this is scaled up 3300. So for that graphic to appear the same size as it was when I dragged it in, it has to be scaled down to 3%. If you were doing kind of a series of these zooms, which is very possible, you might have kind of like 4 or 5 vector artworks and you want to zoom into each one. It's like an infinite zoom essentially. Imagine doing it again. The scale for that graphic would then be kind of 0.01. It would pretty much be impossible to use. So we need to think of another way of doing it. In this situation we could probably get away with doing it like this, but if we wanted to do another zoom in, it just wouldn't work. So how can we go about fixing that? So I've deleted all those keys and I've taken that graphic logo type off the timeline, basically back to where we were before we did that transition. We're going to do it a different way. So the way to resolve this is to basically create a new null and have that as the new controller, and then all you need to do is parent the old main controller to the new one. So the easiest way to do that is to just duplicate the null that we have already, press U to open the keys. We can delete all the keys from this. We can set the scale to this to say 10. Okay, now that's probably a little bit small. Let's go 50%. There's nothing actually connected to it at the moment, so it's totally up to us. I can just pull this null over here where I know it's somewhere around here that I want to zoom into. Trim the layer to there. And then lastly, parent the main controller to this. That means that everything that's parented to the main controller 01 will carry on moving when we animate main controller 02. Because we've gone back to a scale of 50, we won't need to scale up to several thousand. It will only be a few hundred, which means any new elements we bring in will be kind of manageable. And then you can repeat this process again and again to create your infinite zoom. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to set that up. I've animated the anchor point, scale and rotation of this null. If you notice, as we scrub through, everything still follows, the animation still works, but when we reach the final point we're only at 600% scale, whereas before we were at 3300. We can just trim the other layers as well because they're not going to be needed after this point. Review will be needed because that's what makes up the red that we're sitting on, but the dark red solid, we can just trim it off at that point. I'm just going to trim the graphic elements layer as well. Okay, now I'm going to add in the logo type. I've dragged the two Illustrator files into the timeline. I've parented them to main controller 02 and zeroed out the rotation. You can see that they're fitting nicely along the diagonal, so now I'm just going to scale them down to fit and set the colour correctly. So the logo type's now in place. The next thing I'm going to do is animate the anchor point of the two graphics, just so that they kind of slide in from the diagonal line. So I'm going to say 15 frames for the reveal. So I'm just going to jump forward 15 frames and set a key for the anchor point for both of these layers. Just jump back to that key, select those two layers, Alt left bracket just to trim them to there, and now I'm just going to animate this anchor point on each one so that they kind of slide in. I've set those two keys, so it kind of does that at the moment. I'm just going to select these and then put a easy ease, just so it eases into position. The next thing to do is just to sort out the graphic. When it's at this point here, it should be invisible. So the easiest way to do that is just with a track matte. So I'm going to add a solid up here and set it to alpha matte. The great thing with this workflow is that when I drag my solid in, as soon as I parent it to the main controller and hit R, I can zero that out as I have before, and it works, even if you've picked the wrong solid. So I'll just swap that. That's better. Trim that layer to there, and then just reposition it. So that layer is now in position. We hit F4 on the graphic layer. We just set this to alpha matte pale yellow solid. It should disappear, and then as we scrub through, we'll see it reappear. Okay, so what's next? At the moment the animation is a little bit static. We've got a few more things to animate, but one thing we could do is just animate the main controllers overall so that they're continually moving. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm just going to set some rotation keyframes for the two main controllers. I've animated the rotation parameter of the main controllers. They now just change by 5% between these keys. So as we scrub through, you can see that the animation has got slightly more motion. Just keeps it, keeps it a little bit more alive. The next thing we're going to do is just animate the graphic text and the review text. I think we'll start with review because that one is kind of slightly similar. The most important thing to remember here is that the text is in the correct place for the transition. So at this point here where we know it's correct, what we want to do is just set a key for that. So the rule of thumb really is just to remember to set the last key first. So if I find the review layer, which is this one, open up P, Alt P to set a key there, jump to the in, and now I can just scrub the value. I'm going to just move it down so the R is just off the edge of the screen. So when we arrive at that point, it starts animating on. I've just noticed as well, since I've added the rotation parameters, the keys for the main controllers, up here the green graphic is showing already. We probably want to just move that slightly out of Right, we should be good to go on that shot. Let's just scrub through and have a quick look. Now the review's animating in, it spins around and we end up in the correct place. Great stuff. It's moving quite fast and the letters are quite big. If I come back here, I can see that the graphic text isn't quite so large. I'm just going to scale that all up so that it kind of is the same size, and then it will move at a similar speed as well. I've scaled that up now. I've actually just scaled up the solid. We've got continuous rasterization on, so I don't really need to worry about scaling up the mask on its own. So if we just go to the point of at the end of the transition, and we select our dark red solid and set a key for the position, and then we can go to the in point of that layer, and now we can animate the position so that wrong parameter, sorry, so that the graphic starts kind of around there. Let's quickly scrub through. Great, that all looks cool. I've round previewed it so we can have a quick look to see where we are. Everything looks okay to me. Just going to add a few finishing touches and we should be done. I'm going to add a slight vignette, so I'll just drag a solid onto the timeline and double click the ellipse mask tool, invert that mask and give it a pretty big feather, say 400. Okay, and the other thing I'm going to do is just colour it the dark browny red. That all looks fine. Just lower the opacity to about 20. So to get this ready for output, we work in PAL, so I'm just going to drag the main comp to create a new comp and rename this PAL. Open up comp settings and set it to PAL D1 widescreen. The pixel aspect ratio will change and it'll squash it all up, but that's perfectly fine. When working with vector images or any images that have got hard edges, you're going to notice quite a bit of flicker on your broadcast monitor. You can't see it on the computer monitor, but as soon as you put it on a TV with fields, a lot of the lines will be kind of halfway between the two fields and it will flicker quite a lot. Now the best solution to that is just to add a slight blur. I normally use box blur. I'll just set it to about 0.7, 2 iterations, and just put it on vertical only. Now you can just about see the effect that that has, but if you preview that on a broadcast monitor and switch the effect on and off, it will drastically reduce any flicker. So select the comp, Shift Command / to add it to the render queue. We're ready to output. Just as we're about to hit render, so we can leave and go down the pub to meet our mates, the client rings up and they've actually changed the logo. They need it done straight away because obviously this is going to be online tomorrow, so let's have a look at the new logo and how we can incorporate that. Back in Illustrator, you can see that's the original logo that we've been using. Here's the new one. Okay, so it isn't too different, although it looks to me the kerning has changed, so that's going to create an issue for us because obviously we've based our transitions on the edges of those letters, so we'll probably have to line that up again, but it shouldn't be too tricky. Back in After Effects, the first thing I'm going to do is just swap the Illustrator files for the new versions. If we, at the end of the comp, we can see whether it's going to work or not. So first of all, select Graphic, Command H, select the logo type, and we just choose the layer. And I'm going to set that to a layer size. Okay, that worked just fine. The same for review. Okay, that's worked fine as well. Now you can see the problem where the kerning's changed. The transition, the point where it needs to be on the transition has moved. So if we select the review layer, press P for position. Now we could jump back to this key here and try and work it out. That's probably the easiest way, so I'm just going to zoom in slightly, hold down Command and just scrub this value until it's where we want it, which is about there. That wasn't too painful. All the rest of the animation still works fine. So we need to go back and change graphic at the beginning again. Now this is slightly different because, as you remember, we used a mask for this, so we can't just swap the Illustrator file. What we're going to have to do is just recreate that solid. Close this up, duplicate the solid, Command D, opacity 50. Okay, I'm just going to tilde that so I can see what I'm doing. Press M for mask and delete all the masks. Jump over to Illustrator again. It's the graphic that we want, so I'm just going to click here, select the paths, copy, back into After Effects, and then just paste them onto that layer. Again, the important thing to remember is that we line up the layers so that the point of transition is in the same place, and we know that's on the edge of the P. I'm going to scrub through so we can see the P, the point of transition, not quite that far, and now I'm just going to resize this mask and position it where it needs to be. This looks okay. I just scrub through to make sure that the transition still works and everything's in the right place. Okay, so now we can delete the other layers set the opacity on here to the correct amount. If you notice, I've also just got to change the mask settings. They're all set to subtract, that should be fine now. Let's have a quick look. There we go. Okay, I've just noticed another problem from the new logo being brought in. Because the kerning's changed, when we get to this point here, you can see a small piece of red up here. So what that means is we're just going to need to scale that up more than we have already. The scaling's all done on the controller now, so let's jump back to that keyframe, and now we're just going to have to adjust this, say 650. That looks good. Obviously it's all moved, so we just need to adjust our anchor point again. That looks about right. Let's just scrub through to make sure I've lined it up okay. Yeah, cool. So there you go, we've just incorporated the new logo. It's only taken us 5 seconds. We should be able to go to our render queue, output this now. Normally what we do is we tend to output to digital files and supply them to our clients for onlining via FTP. Before I output it, I'll just have one final check to look through, make sure I can't see any errors. Check, check, check again. It's always a good idea to check as many times as possible. I can't really see any problems, so I'm just going to output that now and get it ready for upload. So here's the rendered movie. Just quickly check it again in QuickTime. As I said before, I tend to check everything about 1 million times because you never know what you've missed. All looks good. So now we just zip that up and it's ready to be delivered. So that's the end of the first lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. In that lesson we covered continuous rasterization, motion blur, dynamic parenting. Hopefully it was useful for some of you. Next week what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at particle systems and how we can use those in our motion graphics. So we'll be going through the particle systems that come bundled with After Effects and also be looking at third-party solutions such as Particular. Thanks ever so much for watching. I hope to see you again next week. Any questions, just please post it in the forum. Thanks again.